This is a lecture on evolution for Bio 101 for September 2nd, 2020. And in this portion of the lecture, we're going to define evolution and talk about some of the mechanisms by which it happens. And then in the second half of this lecture, we'll talk about some evidence for evolution. And so just to recap on what we've been talking about in class over the last several lectures, life is diverse, right? And that diversity exists not only between kingdoms, so like diversity between plants and animals, but within each kingdom. So even within the kingdom Animalia that we just talked about, that encompasses everything from ladybugs to cats to dolphins to humans. So there's a ton of diversity. And that diversity comes from evolution. And what evolution is defined as is a change in a species over time. And in this definition, time means many generations. So not just several months or years, but many, many thousands of years or many generations of that species. And it also, because contains this word species, means that an individual does not evolve or change over time. Because how can an individual evolve over generations? An individual only has one generation. And so individuals can adapt short term, but they can't evolve long term. And evolution is also sometimes known as descent with modification, because you have this idea of generations of descent with small changes that happens over time. And people have been noticing and suggesting that species change over time since ancient Greece. But the first person who really came up with a mechanism to explain how those changes occurred was Charles Darwin. You can see here this great picture on the right-hand side. And Charles Darwin was a British naturalist, so somebody who studied nature, animals and plants out in the wild, and he wrote this sort of seminal work called On the Origin of Species, where he explained the mechanism that he believed was responsible for evolution, which is the thing that he deemed natural selection. And we're going to talk a little bit about how he came to this theory, as well as what it means in the next few slides. And so how did he come up with this idea of natural selection? Darwin spent several years kind of sailing around the world, looking at things and collecting a lot of data. And he traveled to Australia, he traveled to Africa, but he spent a majority of his time in South America, more particularly off the coast of Ecuador in a small set of islands known as the Galapagos, which you can see here. And on his travels, particularly in the Galapagos, he encountered the species of bird, this type of finch, which are now sometimes known as Darwins finches. And what he noticed was that all of these birds were of the same species of finch, but they had a lot of different types of beaks. So this is all the same sort of these are all different finches, right? And some of them have these large, kind of hard, thick shaped beaks that are more short and broad. And some of them have these longer, skinnier types of beaks. But these are all finches, right? And so after watching these finches for a while, what Darwin noticed was that each of these different types of beaks was correlated to the type of the food that the birds ate. And so birds that had these types of beaks up here in number 1 were more likely to be eating nuts. And they needed this kind of short, broad, strong beak to crack those nuts open. Whereas birds with the smaller beaks were eating either insects that were living in holes, or they were eating nectar from flowers, and they needed that small, precise beak to get into those small locations to get their foods. And so based on which type of food the bird ate, that's what type of beak that they had. And so he started to wonder why that might be, and how the type of food could really contribute to a change in the beak size of these birds. And so he came up with this idea of natural selection, and it's based on 3 different things. The first of which is that these characteristics, like beak size and shape, or traits, are passed from parents to offspring. So they're inherited from one generation to the next. The second kind of important thing to take into account for natural selection is that there are more offspring produced than can actually survive in the environment. And that means that there is a competition for limited resources. Resources are usually, they're scarce in nature. And so it's possible that birds who are eating nuts were all competing for that resource. And those that had those certain types of beaks were better at getting them, and therefore more competitive. And it's important for natural selection to occur that there's variation in the traits that are inherited, right? And so all those different beak sizes need to be in effect for one to be better than the other. Otherwise, how can one be better than the other, right? And so this idea of having traits that are passed from parents to offspring, these traits having a variation so that they can confer some sort of benefit to offspring that help them in their limited competition for resources, is how Darwin came up with this statement, which is the definition of natural selection. This idea that offspring that inherit the traits that allow them to best compete for the limited resources will survive, and not only will they survive, but they will have more offspring than those with the less favorable traits. And so natural selection is often also known as survival of the fittest. And fitness is just the ability to survive and reproduce, to pass your genes on to the next generation. And so the fittest organisms, or those with the best traits, are able to survive because they can compete the best for the resources, and they're able to have more offspring as a result. And as I stated before, natural selection would not work without variation or differences within a population. Because if there's no variation, there's no best and worst traits, right? There's no difference in the trait at all. So one organism can't be better or worse than another, and there will be no advantage and there will be no natural selection. And so these differences can't be something, they have to be something that is heritable or genetic, something that can be passed from parents to offspring. And variation in genes can come from two places. Most of the time, the variation in genes comes from what are called mutations or changes in the DNA. And mutations can be good, they can be bad, or they can be neutral and have no effect. Most mutations are neutral, which is why that statement is underlined here. But some mutations are good and they can confer beneficial advantage, and others are negative, and they can result in death of an organism. And so these mutations provide some variation on which natural selection can work. The other main component that confers variation in genes is sexual reproduction, where the genes of one organism are essentially mixed with the genes of the other organism it chooses to sexually reproduce with, and the mixing of those genes creates some variation for offspring as well. And that variation, once again, is super important for natural selection to work. And so natural selection and mutation are sort of two of the main mechanisms for how evolution can occur, or how a species can change over time, right? So it might change due to natural selection, or it might change due to mutations. There are other mechanisms of evolution, the first of which is sort of a random evolution by chance. And that's what's known as genetic drift. And genetic drift tends to affect very small populations. And you can see here an example of how genetic drift might work. And so there's a population here that consists of about 1/3 green beetles and 2/3 tan beetles. And then there's a random event. There's a person that happens to walk by, and by chance, he kills almost all of the green beetles. And you can see that generates a completely different population where most of the beetles are now tan, and there's only one green beetle left. And so as a result, this small population has been changed over time, basically due to chance or genetic drift. And you can imagine that it's going to be hard for this green beetle to maintain its genes in a population of tan beetles. And it's possible that that green beetle might eventually be completely removed from the population, and the whole population will be tan. And that is evolution that happens due to chance or genetic drift. And there's also this idea of gene flow, or the movement of genes between populations. So either into a population or out of one. And that's because most organisms are able to move in some type of way, right? And that migration between populations, in this case of the tan beetle migrating into the green population, can move genes along with it, right? Because the tan beetle might come into this population and start mating with green beetles, and it now has added genetic differences and variation to this population. And that flow of genes can contribute to evolution or change in species over time as well. And so the 4 mechanisms of evolution that we're going to need to know are natural selection, mutation, evolution by chance or genetic drift, and then evolution by migration or gene flow. And so just a brief summary of this lecture. Evolution is a change in a species over time, and it is distinct from natural selection. And I think sometimes you think of those two terms as synonymous, but evolution is the change and natural selection is the mechanism by which the change happens. And so based on natural selection, organisms who have the traits that make them the most fit are able to reproduce, and they pass on their beneficial traits to their offspring, and those beneficial traits are the ones that are selected for or persist over time. And in order for natural selection to happen, there has to be some kind of variation within these heritable traits. And natural selection isn't the only way that evolution can happen. Genetic drift and gene flow will also result in the evolution of a